The drunk military student was barely holding himself upright when he stumbled into the back of the yellow taxi at 2:47 a.m. outside Murphy's Pub in downtown Boston. His dress uniform was wrinkled beyond recognition, brass buttons tarnished from hours of celebration, and the overwhelming stench of whiskey and beer filled the vehicle's interior like a noxious cloud that seemed to cling to every surface. The young soldier's head lolled against the cracked leather seat as he mumbled incomprehensible directions through slurred speech, his military bearing completely abandoned in favor of the loose-limbed posture of someone who had pushed their alcohol tolerance far beyond reasonable limits. Marcus Thompson shifted the taxi into drive without saying a word, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of steady control that suggested decades of experience navigating both Boston's chaotic streets and far more dangerous terrain. At 62 years old, he had been driving the night shift for 8 years, always taking the calls that other drivers avoided. The belligerent drunks, the emergency hospital runs, the sketchy pickup locations and neighborhoods where most cabbies refused to venture after dark. His reputation among the dispatchers was built on reliability rather than conversation. He never complained about difficult passengers, never called in sick, and never asked questions about destinations that might raise eyebrows among less experienced drivers. The taxi's interior was immaculate, despite its age. Every surface cleaned and maintained with military precision that most passengers attributed to simple professionalism rather than ingrained habits from a previous life. The radio stayed tuned to emergency services frequencies instead of music stations, though Thompson kept the volume low enough that passengers rarely noticed the constant chatter of police dispatch and ambulance calls that provided him with a real-time map of the city's nightly chaos. His eyes moved constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the automatic awareness of someone trained to survive in hostile environments. The young soldier in the back seat had stopped trying to give directions and was now making concerning sounds that immediately triggered Thompson's combat medical training. 23 years of active duty had taught him to recognize the difference between ordinary drunkenness and medical emergencies that required immediate intervention. The passenger's breathing had become shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on an alarming grayish pallor, and the wet choking noises suggested that alcohol poisoning was progressing toward potentially fatal respiratory depression. Without hesitation, Thompson executed a sharp U-turn that violated several traffic laws and basic safety protocols, abandoning the original destination in favor of Massachusetts General Hospital's emergency entrance. His driving became more aggressive as he navigated through the maze of one-way streets that connected Boston's entertainment district to the medical complex, running yellow lights and taking calculated risks that demonstrated both intimate knowledge of the city's traffic patterns and complete confidence in his vehicle handling abilities under pressure. The hospital's emergency entrance was bathed in harsh fluorescent lighting that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like surgical instruments, creating stark shadows that emphasized the urgency of medical situations that unfolded there every night. Thompson pulled up to the automatic doors with practiced precision, leaving the engine running as he quickly assessed the soldier's deteriorating condition. The young man's breathing had become even more labored, and his skin had progressed from gray to an alarming blue tint around the lips that indicated severe oxygen deprivation. Thompson's extraction of the unconscious passenger from the taxi's back seat was executed with the fluid efficiency of someone who had carried wounded soldiers across hostile terrain under enemy fire. He supported the full weight of the larger man without apparent strain, moving toward the emergency room entrance with swift but controlled steps that covered ground rapidly without breaking into an obvious run. His approach to the automatic doors triggered the attention of the triage nurse before he had even entered the building, her experienced eye immediately recognizing the signs of a serious medical emergency. The emergency room staff took immediate custody of the patient with the kind of coordinated response that characterized major trauma centers during peak operating hours. Within minutes, the young soldier was being wheeled toward intensive care on a gurney, surrounded by medical personnel who worked with the calm urgency that separated experienced emergency medicine practitioners from those still learning to manage life-threatening situations. Thompson stepped back from the controlled chaos. His role in the emergency effectively completed, but he remained in the waiting area rather than returning immediately to his taxi. Standard hospital protocol required identification verification for all incoming patients, especially those brought in unconscious and unable to provide their own contact information or medical history. The admissions clerk, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, who had processed thousands of emergency cases during her 15 years at Massachusetts General, approached Thompson with a clipboard and routine questions that came with late-night medical situations. She needed insurance information, emergency contacts, and most importantly, she needed to verify the identity of the Good Samaritan who had potentially saved the young soldier's life. Thompson reached into his worn leather wallet without any apparent reluctance, extracting what appeared to be a standard Massachusetts driver's license, along with a taxi company identification card that all drivers were required to carry during their shifts. Patricia glanced at the documents with the perfunctory attention of someone who had reviewed thousands of similar identifications, preparing to copy down the basic information required for hospital records and potential insurance claims. Her pen was already moving across the admission forms when something on the driver's license made her pause and look more carefully at the small print below the standard personal information. The license was clearly legitimate, issued by the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles, with all the proper security features and official seals that distinguished authentic documents from the fake identification that occasionally appeared in emergency rooms. But there was additional information printed in the endorsement section that seemed completely incongruous with the humble appearance of the taxi driver standing before her. Below the standard personal details, in the section typically reserved for commercial driving permits or medical restrictions, were 3 letters that carried enormous significance within military and law enforcement circles. SOF, Special Operations Forces. Patricia's confusion deepened as she continued reading the document, discovering notations that seemed to belong in a different universe from the one occupied by Boston taxi drivers working the night shift. The endorsements section contained references to federal security clearances, specialized military training certifications, and operational qualifications that sounded more like elements from an action movie than credentials possessed by someone who transported drunk college students and late-night shift workers around the city for minimum wage, plus tips. The notation that caught Patricia's attention most dramatically wasn't the Special Operations Forces designation, though that alone would have been enough to transform her perception of the quiet taxi driver standing before her. What made her hands tremble slightly as she examined the document more carefully was the rank and unit information printed in even smaller font directly underneath the federal endorsements. Lieutenant Colonel, Philadelphia's Ranger Regiment, United States Army Special Operations Command, followed by a series of numbers and codes that meant nothing to civilian eyes, but would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military intelligence background. Patricia had worked in hospital administration long enough to encounter various types of identification documents, from fake IDs carried by underage college students to the elaborate credentials possessed by federal agents and diplomatic personnel who occasionally appeared in emergency situations. But she had never seen a Massachusetts driver's license that contained military rank information, federal security clearance notations, and operational certifications that seemed to belong in a Pentagon briefing room rather than a taxi driver's wallet. The cognitive dissonance between Thompson's humble appearance and the explosive implications of his identification created a moment of profound confusion that left her staring at the document, as if it might suddenly reveal itself to be an elaborate forgery. Thompson waited patiently while Patricia processed the information, his posture remaining relaxed but alert in the way that suggested military training despite his civilian clothes. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the emergency room cast sharp shadows across his weathered face, highlighting old scars that most people had attributed to years of navigating Boston's aggressive traffic, rather than combat operations in hostile territories, where American forces had been engaged in classified missions that never appeared in newspaper headlines or evening news broadcasts. The verification process that followed Patricia's discovery required phone calls to military databases that operated 24 hours a day for exactly these types of situations. The night administrator, Janet Morrison, was summoned from her office to authorize access to federal personnel records that required special clearances and security protocols that went far beyond standard hospital administrative procedures. Each inquiry generated additional questions rather than providing simple confirmation, as Thompson's service record contained enough redacted sections and classified notations to fill several filing cabinets in secure government facilities. Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief of emergency medicine, found herself dealing with an unprecedented situation that fell outside all of her previous experience managing crisis situations in a major urban hospital. Her medical training had prepared her to handle everything from multiple trauma cases to potential bioterrorism incidents, but the presence of a highly decorated special operations officer working as a taxi driver created complexity that had no established protocols or standard operating procedures. She needed to understand whether Thompson represented any kind of security concern for the hospital, while also processing the implications of having someone with his background operating unrecognized in Boston's civilian transportation system. The phone calls to military verification services revealed details that seemed to belong in the pages of classified operational histories, rather than the personnel files of retired soldiers living quiet civilian lives. Thompson's service record included deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and several other locations that remained redacted, even in official documentation accessed through proper channels. His commendations read like a catalog of America's most dangerous military operations over the past 3 decades. Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, Bronze Star with V Device for Valor, Purple Heart with 2 additional awards, Combat Infantry Badge, Ranger Tab, Special Forces Tab, and numerous unit citations for classified operations that had shaped American foreign policy in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Thompson's explanation for his current circumstances was delivered in the same measured tone he used for all communication, whether discussing taxi routes with passengers or responding to increasingly urgent questions from hospital administrators who were struggling to understand how someone with his background had ended up driving a cab through Boston's streets. 8 years earlier, he had retired from active duty after sustaining injuries during a classified operation that left him with chronic pain, traumatic brain injury complications, and what military psychologists euphemistically termed adjustment difficulties that made traditional post-military career paths challenging or impossible to maintain. The nighttime taxi driving provided steady income without the social demands and interpersonal stress that characterized most civilian employment opportunities available to retiring military personnel. The work allowed him to maintain a sense of purpose through service to others while avoiding the complex bureaucratic structures and office politics that had become increasingly difficult for him to navigate after decades of military operations where chain of command was clear and mission objectives were unambiguous. The solitary nature of taxi driving suited his preference for controlling his environment and limiting unpredictable social interactions that could trigger anxiety responses related to his combat experiences. Private Daniel Rodriguez, the young soldier whose life Thompson had potentially saved through his quick recognition of alcohol poisoning symptoms, was a 22-year-old military police officer from Worcester who had been celebrating his upcoming deployment to Germany with friends from his unit stationed at nearby Hanscom Air Force Base. The celebration had started reasonably, but had escalated throughout the evening as the group moved between various bars and clubs in Boston's entertainment district, with Rodriguez consuming dangerous quantities of alcohol while trying to keep pace with older, more experienced soldiers who had developed higher tolerance levels through years of military social drinking culture. Thompson's decision to bypass 3 closer hospitals in favor of Massachusetts General wasn't random or arbitrary, but represented tactical thinking that drew on his extensive experience with medical emergencies in combat zones, where the quality of available care could determine the difference between survival and death. Massachusetts General had the best trauma unit in the city, the most experienced emergency medicine staff, and the kind of specialized resources that could handle complicated medical situations involving alcohol poisoning, drug interactions, or other conditions that might not be immediately apparent to first responders without advanced medical training. The hospital's computer systems began generating automatic notifications as Thompson's military records were accessed through federal databases, triggering security protocols that alerted various government agencies to the fact that a highly classified former special operations officer had come to official attention in a civilian emergency situation. These notifications weren't necessarily problematic, but they represented the kind of bureaucratic complications that Thompson had been successfully avoiding for 8 years. By maintaining a low profile and staying out of situations that might require official identification or background verification, as dawn approached and the immediate medical crisis surrounding Private Rodriguez stabilized, the broader implications of Thompson's revelation began rippling through Massachusetts General's administrative structure, like shock waves from an explosion whose full impact wouldn't be understood until much later. The hospital staff who had initially treated him as just another helpful citizen had gradually shifted their behavior toward the respectful deference typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or federal officials, though Thompson's demeanor remained unchanged, regardless of how others chose to interact with him. Within 72 hours of the hospital incident, Thompson's story had reached the Pentagon through intelligence channels that moved faster than official military communications networks. Senior officers who had served alongside him during classified operations in the Hindu Kush Mountains and the urban battlefields of Fallujah began making discreet inquiries through back-channel contacts, many expressing genuine shock that one of the most respected special operations leaders of his generation had essentially vanished into the anonymity of civilian transportation work without any of his former colleagues being aware of his circumstances. The special operations community was legendarily tight-knit, bound together by shared experiences that couldn't be discussed with outsiders and operational secrets that created lifelong bonds between men who had trusted each other with their lives in situations that defied conventional understanding of human endurance and sacrifice. The fact that Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson had been driving a taxi through Boston's streets for 8 years without recognition by a single veteran or active duty personnel represented a systemic failure that troubled senior leaders who prided themselves on taking care of their own, especially those who had given so much in service to classified missions that would never receive public recognition or historical acknowledgement. The Boston Globe received multiple anonymous tips about Thompson's story from sources within the hospital administration, the taxi company, and even federal agencies that had been automatically notified when his military records were accessed through official channels. The newspaper's veteran affairs reporter, Kevin O'Sullivan, initially approached the lead with skepticism born from years of investigating urban legends and exaggerated hero stories that rarely held up under journalistic scrutiny. However, his preliminary verification efforts through military contacts revealed a service record so heavily classified that even basic confirmation required security clearances that most journalists would never possess. O'Sullivan's investigation uncovered fragments of information that painted a picture of military service so distinguished and so secretive that it bordered on mythological status within special operations circles. Thompson's name appeared in heavily redacted after-action reports from operations that had shaped American foreign policy in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations where U.S. forces had been engaged in activities that remained classified decades after their completion. His operational history included participation in hostage rescue missions, counterterrorism operations, and what military euphemistically termed direct action, assignments that involved eliminating high-value targets in circumstances where conventional military engagement wasn't politically feasible. The verification process revealed commendations and citations that read like a catalog of America's most dangerous and most successful military operations over the past 30 years. Thompson had been awarded the Silver Star twice, once for leading a rescue mission deep into enemy territory to extract captured American personnel, and again for single-handedly defending a forward operating base against overwhelming enemy assault, while his unit evacuated wounded soldiers. The Bronze Star with V device had been earned during urban combat operations, where his tactical leadership had prevented what could have been a devastating defeat for American forces caught in a carefully planned enemy ambush. His Purple Heart Awards told a story of physical sacrifice that most people could barely comprehend, with each citation representing injuries sustained during combat operations where retreat wasn't an option and mission completion required, pushing through pain and trauma that would have incapacitated ordinary soldiers. The medical records associated with these awards remained heavily classified, but they suggested exposure to chemical weapons, severe blast injuries from improvised explosive devices, and multiple gunshot wounds sustained during close-quarters combat in environments where survival depended on superior training, equipment, and the kind of mental toughness that couldn't be taught through conventional military education. Thompson continued his nightly routine without acknowledging the growing media attention surrounding his identity, maintaining the same professional distance from publicity that had characterized his approach to classified military operations, where success depended on operating without recognition or acknowledgement. Every evening at exactly 6:00 p.m., he arrived at the taxi garage, conducted his pre-drive vehicle inspection with the same methodical attention to detail that had kept him alive during missions where equipment failure could mean death, and began another 10-hour shift, navigating Boston's streets with quiet competence that passengers attributed to simple professionalism rather than world-class tactical training. The veteran community in Boston began organizing what they diplomatically termed appreciation rides, deliberately calling Thompson's taxi for legitimate transportation needs, while using the opportunity to express gratitude for his service and provide additional income through generous tips that reflected their understanding the financial challenges facing many retired military personnel. These passengers were typically former service members themselves, people who understood the complex emotions surrounding transition from military to civilian life, and the difficulty of finding meaningful purpose after leaving the structured environment of military service, where every day had clear objectives and measurable contributions to national security. Massachusetts Veterans Services found itself fielding dozens of calls from organizations wanting to honor Thompson with ceremonies, awards, and public recognition events that he consistently declined through polite but firm responses delivered through intermediaries who understood his preference for avoiding publicity. His reasoning was straightforward and unwavering. He had chosen taxi driving specifically because it allowed him to serve his community without the expectations, social obligations, and public scrutiny that came with recognition of his military background. The growing attention was transforming his carefully constructed anonymity into something approaching celebrity status, which contradicted everything he had sought to achieve through his deliberate choice of low-profile, post-military employment. The taxi company that employed Thompson discovered that having a decorated war hero among their drivers provided significant positive publicity and increased customer interest, though management was careful to respect his stated preference for being treated like any other employee, rather than receiving special accommodation or recognition that might make his work environment uncomfortable. Other drivers initially worried that Thompson's presence might create unrealistic expectations for their own performance, but they quickly discovered that his military background translated into quiet professionalism and reliability that actually made their jobs easier by improving the company's overall reputation with both customers and law enforcement agencias. Private Rodriguez recovered fully from his alcohol poisoning and formally requested permission through military channels to meet the man who had potentially saved his life, understanding that such encounters required careful coordination when they involved personnel with Thompson's security background and operational history. The hospital arranged a brief meeting that lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Thompson accepted the young soldier's thanks with characteristic modesty, while providing practical advice about responsible drinking, the importance of looking out for fellow service members, and the reality that military careers could end Suddenly, due to preventable incidents that seemed insignificant at the time, but had lasting consequences for professional development and personal safety. The photograph taken during this meeting by a hospital staff member, showing Thompson in civilian clothes speaking quietly with Rodriguez in his military uniform, became one of the most widely shared images on military social media platforms within 48 hours of being posted. The visual contrast between the humble taxi driver and the formal military setting, combined with the story behind their meeting, generated thousands of comments from active duty personnel and veterans who recognized the profound significance of an encounter between someone at the beginning of military service and someone whose career had embodied the highest traditions of American Special Operations Forces. 6 months after the hospital incident, Thompson's life had found a new equilibrium that balanced his desire for anonymity with the reality that his story had become part of Boston's urban mythology. The initial media frenzy had subsided, replaced by a quieter form of recognition that manifested in small gestures of respect from passengers who knew his background but understood his preference for treating each ride as simply another professional transaction between driver and customer. The taxi company had installed a discreet memorial plaque near Thompson's parking space, acknowledging his military service without creating the kind of spectacle that would have made him uncomfortable or drawn unwanted attention from tourists seeking to photograph a local celebrity. His colleagues had developed a protective attitude toward their famous co-worker, understanding that his presence elevated their entire operation, while respecting his stated desire to be treated as just another driver working the difficult overnight shift that most people preferred to avoid. Private Rodriguez had shared Thompson's story throughout his military unit and beyond, creating ripple effects that reached installations across New England, where young soldiers were learning that heroism could take many forms, and that service to others didn't automatically end when uniforms were retired. The story had become part of informal military education, passed along by senior non-commissioned officers as an example of how to maintain honor and purpose through life's inevitable transitions and unexpected challenges. Thompson's routine remained unchanged despite everything that had happened, a testament to his belief that consistency and reliability were more important than recognition or accommodation for his unique circumstances. Every evening at exactly 6:00 p.m., he arrived at the garage, conducted his vehicle inspection, and began another shift with the same quiet competence that had characterized both his military service and his civilian career. Boston's emergency services community had quietly adopted Thompson as an unofficial member of their network, understanding that his presence represented an additional layer of experienced response capability during the city's most vulnerable hours. His radio remained tuned to emergency frequencies, and first responders had grown accustomed to seeing his taxi at accident scenes, where his military medical training continued to save lives long after his official service had ended. The question that had launched this story had been answered not through interviews or explanations, but through the simple demonstration of character over time. Thompson had proven that choosing service over status, purpose over profit, and contribution over recognition represented the highest form of continued military service, regardless of the uniform being worn or the title being held. If this story has moved you, take a moment to think about the Marcus Thompsons in your own community. Share this with someone who needs to hear about quiet heroism. Hit that subscribe button for more stories that honor everyday heroes, and tell us in the comments about a veteran or essential worker whose service has made a difference in your life. These stories matter because they remind us that the most profound impact often happens when nobody is watching.